I never intended to uncover anything unusual when I first began researching Siberian logging operations. My original focus was narrow and academic. I was studying labor systems in pre-Soviet Russia, how work crews were organized, how remote camps functioned, and how industrial extraction supported imperial expansion. It was the kind of research that usually ends up summarized in charts, production tables, and forgotten reports. Nothing about it suggested mystery. Nothing about it suggested controversy. It was supposed to be ordinary history. 4 months, I worked through archives, shipping records, payroll documents, and company correspondence. Names, dates, quantities, wages. Timber volumes transported across frozen rivers. Seasonal employment cycles. Everything fit neatly into established narratives. Siberia was harsh, dangerous, and economically valuable. Workers were expendable. Companies were efficient. The empire expanded. Then, buried inside a collection of forestry reports, I found a small envelope marked simply Field Documentation 1889. Inside were photographs. Not sketches. Not illustrations. Not artistic impressions. Photographs. They were printed on aging paper, edges curled, surfaces cracked with time. Some were mounted on cardboard. Others were loose. All were taken in remote forest camps. Men standing beside enormous piles of freshly cut timber. Snow-covered ground. Rough wooden shelters. Primitive machinery. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then I noticed the scale. In one image, a line of workers stood shoulder to shoulder. Most of them were average height, bundled in heavy coats and fur hats. But one man stood nearly a head and a half taller than everyone else. His shoulders were wider. His arms were longer. His boots alone looked the size of small suitcases. I assumed it was a trick of perspective. Old cameras often distort depth. A person standing closer to the lens can appear larger. It happens constantly in early photography. I dismissed it and moved on, until I saw the next photo, and the next, and the next. Different camps, different photographers, different years. Same pattern. Normal-sized workers. And among them, towering individuals. Some appeared 9 feet tall. Some looked even taller. At that point, curiosity replaced routine. I began examining the images more carefully. I measured shadow lengths. I compared snow compression under boots. I checked background alignment. Trees, cabins, equipment, all matched consistently across figures. No sign of manipulation. No sign of staging. No visual trickery. The proportions were real. These people were genuinely enormous. What unsettled me most was how casually they were included. No captions mentioning height. No notes explaining anomalies. No emphasis in composition. They were never placed in the center. Never highlighted. Never isolated. They were simply there. Part of the crew. Part of the work. I searched deeper into archival collections. Russian imperial repositories contain dozens of similar images preserved on glass plate negatives. French scientific expeditions had albums documenting forestry resources. Swedish logging corporations kept meticulous visual records of their workforce. Everywhere I looked, the same phenomenon appeared. Men and occasionally women of extraordinary size, integrated into industrial labor operations. One French expedition report from 1891 finally confirmed what the photographs suggested. It described individuals of exceptional height, estimated between 2.7 and 3.2 meters, performing heavy timber work with efficiency exceeding normal laborers. 3 meters. Nearly 10 feet tall. The tone was clinical, detached, almost bored. No astonishment. No speculation. No follow-up. The report immediately moved on to transportation logistics. As if encountering multiple 10-foot workers in the Siberian wilderness was barely worth mentioning. That detail disturbed me more than anything else, because it meant this was not considered extraordinary at the time. These individuals were not treated as curiosities. They were not treated as medical anomalies. They were not treated as legends. They were workers. Valued laborers recruited for physically demanding tasks. I began questioning everything I thought I knew about 19th century industrial history. If these people existed in such numbers, why were they absent from mainstream scholarship? Why were they never discussed in textbooks? Why were they never analyzed in medical literature? Why did no major historian seem interested? The more I searched, the more images I uncovered. Some were labeled. Many were not. Some were damaged. Others were perfectly preserved. But all told the same silent story. An entire category of human beings had participated in one of the most important industrial expansions in Eurasian history. And somehow their existence had faded into obscurity. They were present in official records, present in corporate archives, present in scientific surveys. And yet they had vanished from collective memory. Standing alone in the archive room late one evening, surrounded by boxes of forgotten photographs, I realized I was no longer studying labor practices. I was staring at evidence of something history had quietly chosen to forget. As the photographs accumulated, I realized that images alone were not enough. Pictures can always be questioned. Perspective can be debated. Shadows can be reinterpreted. Skeptics can always find ways to dismiss what they see. So I turned to something harder to ignore. Physical evidence. Objects do not lie easily. Tools, structures, and equipment preserve the intentions of the people who designed and used them. They carry silent information about bodies, strength, and daily routines. If these towering workers truly existed, their presence would be embedded in the material culture of Siberian industry. And that is exactly what I found. The first clue appeared in logging tools. Crosscut saws used in Europe and North America during the late 19th century were remarkably standardized. Most ranged between 5 and 7 feet in length. They were designed for two average-sized men working in rhythm, pulling alternately, using leverage rather than brute force. Siberian saws were different. Museum collections and private salvage yards contain specimens measuring 12, 14, even 16 feet long. At first, historians attributed this to oversized timber. Siberian forests were known for massive trees. Larger trees, larger saws. A simple explanation. But when I examined the measurements more closely, the theory began to collapse. The critical detail was not blade length. It was handle spacing. On many of these saws, the grips were positioned 40 to 50 inches apart. For an average man, this distance is biomechanically inefficient. It forces the arms to fully extend, reducing control and power. It turns a precision tool into an awkward burden. For someone with proportional limbs at 9 feet tall, however, the spacing becomes natural, comfortable, optimal. The tools made sense only when matched to unusually large bodies. Then there were the sleds. Deep in remote regions of Siberia, abandoned timber transport sleds still rest beneath layers of ice and soil. Some were uncovered during road construction. Others were found by hunters and surveyors. Most were classified as curiosities. These sleds were enormous, nearly twice the scale of standard logging sleds. Their wooden frames were reinforced with thick iron fittings. Their runners were wider and deeper. Their harness system stretched nearly 7 feet from shoulder mount to load attachment point. Engineers who examined their load capacities estimated weights that would normally require multiple horses or entire teams of workers. Yet where patterns told a different story. Grooves where ropes had rubbed for years. Polished wood where hands had repeatedly grasped. Fractures repaired with improvised metal plates. These were not ceremonial artifacts. They were working machines. Used daily. Used hard. And likely used by bodies capable of controlling them. The camps themselves offered even stronger evidence. Across vast stretches of Siberia, abandoned logging settlements remain scattered through forests and tundra. Most date to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Officially, they were temporary shelters, rebuilt seasonally as operations moved. They should have been minimal, efficient, functional. Instead, they were oversized. Doorways stood 10 to 12 feet high. Sleeping platforms were elevated more than 3 feet above ground. Dining tables and benches were positioned at heights that left average workers' feet hanging awkwardly. Ceilings rose far higher than necessary for heating efficiency. In a climate where every wasted board meant additional labor, these dimensions made no economic sense. Unless the builders were accommodating people much larger than average. The furniture told the same story. Benches were wider. Steps were taller. Ladders had broader spacing. Everything was subtly scaled up. Not extravagantly. Not monumentally. Just enough to suit larger bodies. I examined preserved clothing where possible. Coats, boots, gloves stored in regional museums. Some were unusually large, yet rarely labeled as such. Most were catalogued simply as workwear. Boots measuring over 16 inches long. Coats with sleeves approaching 4 feet. Belts wider than a man's hand. Again, no explanation. Just quiet misclassification. Even hand tools revealed the pattern. Axes with 7-foot handles. Splitting mauls weighing 80 pounds. Pike poles longer than small boats. These were not decorative. Their edges showed sharpening marks. Their grips were worn smooth. Their shafts were darkened by sweat. They had been used extensively for decades. No average worker could have wielded them efficiently. But in the hands of a giant, they became practical instruments. What struck me most was the consistency. These oversized artifacts were not confined to one region. They appeared across Siberia, across the Ural regions, across northern Scandinavia where Russian and Swedish operations overlapped. Same proportions, same scaling, same time period, different companies, different governments, same design logic. It suggested coordination without conspiracy. No one had planned to build for giants. They had simply built for the people who were there, which meant these individuals were not rare exceptions. They were integrated members of the workforce, common enough to influence infrastructure, common enough to shape equipment standards, common enough to leave permanent marks on industrial design. And yet, when modern historians encountered these objects, they hesitated. Instead of asking why, they relabeled ceremonial, experimental, unclear purpose, regional variation, anything but the obvious. Because accepting the obvious meant admitting that an entire category of human variation had been erased from historical understanding. Standing in storage rooms filled with silent tools and forgotten structures, I realized that the photographs were only the beginning. The land itself still carried the imprint of bodies history no longer acknowledged. By the time I reached the final stage of my research, one realization had become impossible to ignore. The evidence was not missing. It had never been missing. It had been ignored. Photographs existed. Tools survived. Buildings remained. Reports were archived. Nothing had been destroyed completely. Nothing had been erased by accident. Instead, it had been quietly sidelined. When I began presenting my findings to academic historians, their reactions followed a familiar pattern. First came polite interest, then careful hesitation, then dismissal. Some blamed perspective distortion. Others pointed to lens curvature in early cameras. A few suggested that unusual growth disorders might explain isolated cases. But none could explain consistency. None could explain hundreds of photographs across decades. None could explain standardized equipment scaled for large bodies. None could explain architecture that wasted resources in extreme climates. When I pressed further, conversations shifted. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. References were avoided. Not with hostility, with discomfort. Museum curators behaved similarly. When I showed them oversized tools, they cataloged them as experimental prototypes or ritual objects. When I pointed out where patterns, they nodded politely and changed the subject. When I asked why no exhibits addressed the obvious implications, I was told such interpretations were speculative. Speculative. Despite physical measurements, despite historical records, despite photographic documentation. The problem was not lack of proof. The problem was where the proof led. Accepting it meant challenging established narratives. It meant admitting that industrial history had relied on bodies we no longer recognized. It meant reopening uncomfortable questions about biology, labor, and classification. It meant acknowledging that modern assumptions about normal humanity might be incomplete. Then came the timeline. Everything changed around 1910. Before that, giants appeared regularly in documentation. After that, they vanished. Not gradually, abruptly. French expeditions stopped photographing laborers. Swedish companies simplified workforce records. German industrial surveys omitted human figures entirely. Russian archives shifted toward machinery and infrastructure. Workers became anonymous silhouettes. Faces disappeared. Bodies disappeared. It was as if someone had decided that documenting people was suddenly unnecessary or undesirable. The Russian Revolution is often blamed. War chaos burned archives. But the pattern begins years earlier. The disappearance precedes political collapse. Something shifted in institutional priorities. Industrial modernization demanded standardization. Standard bodies. Standard productivity. Standard measurements. Anyone who did not fit that model became inconvenient. Too large to classify, too unusual to explain, too disruptive to integrate. So they were quietly removed from records. Not necessarily from life, from history. No evidence suggests mass death. No burial sites. No medical crises. No epidemics. They simply stop appearing, like figures edited out of a photograph. I searched for traces elsewhere. Immigration records showed nothing unusual. Military files contained no references. Urban registries recorded no influx of extraordinarily tall citizens. It was as if these people had dissolved into invisibility. One photograph continued to haunt me. Taken in 1907 during a French timber survey near a remote river settlement. 10 men stood beside stacked logs. 9 were average height. 1 towered over the rest. He was not centered, not highlighted, not framed dramatically. He was simply working, holding a log effortlessly, standing close to his colleagues. They leaned toward him casually as if accustomed to his presence. No awe, no distance, no spectacle, just co-workers. That image destroyed every simplistic explanation. This was not exploitation, not exhibition, not myth-making. This was normal life, which made its disappearance even more disturbing. We did not forget these people because they were unimportant. We forgot them because remembering them would complicate everything. It would challenge modern medical assumptions. It would question population histories. It would undermine neat evolutionary narratives. It would blur the boundaries between normal and abnormal. It would force historians to admit uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. So silence became easier. Classification replaced curiosity. Dismissal replaced investigation. Over time, the absence became accepted as natural. New generations of scholars never noticed what was missing. The gap itself became invisible. Yet the traces remain. Oversized tools rust in barns. Tall doorways stand in empty forests. Photographs sleep in boxes. Waiting for someone willing to ask why. Not to sensationalize. Not to mythologize. But to understand. What were these people really? Where did they come from? How did they live? What happened to them? And what else have we erased simply because it did not fit our models? History is not just what is written. It is also what is omitted. In the Siberian forests, beneath snow and silence, the past still whispers. We just stop listening.